Hi, my name is Fabienne Cola. I'm the president and founder of the Montreal International Black Film Festival. Welcome to the 16th annual Montreal International Black Film Festival, created by the Fabienne Colas Foundation and presented by Québécois in collaboration with Desjardins. The festival runs from September 23rd until October 4th, 2020, and we have for you a festival that is 100% online, a virtual festival where you can stay home with your family and enjoy the festival in your PJs. So do not hesitate to go and check out the program on montrealblackfilm.com and grab your all access pass so you can access over 120 films from 30 countries. Thank you for supporting Black filmmakers. Thank you for amplifying Black voices. The panel today is part of our MIBFF Black Market series presented by Telefilm Canada and Quebec Council for the Arts. So enjoy the panel.
Hi, everyone. uh, Thank you so much for joining us. Just to get started, my name is Kumbi. I go by she, her, they, them pronouns. I just want to start by saying that I am moderating this in Ekjibuktuk, which is the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. And even though Black people don't always have the same story of how we got there, it's still important to recognize who was here first. So I'd like to just jump in and introduce our wonderful guests. We have Josiane Blanc, wave, writer, film director, producer. Short documentary Tales of Ordinary Fat Phobia was produced by the NFB and recently premiered on Radio-Canada. And Josiane is currently in pre-production of 7 episodes of a scripted web series, Blockus. We also have Cheryl Fogo. Wait. Cheryl co-wrote the script for a short educational film called Carol's Mirror. And the first project they directed was another NFB film, The Journey of Lesra Martin. You also, I see a note, have a new film about a Black cowboy releasing as well. Incredible. I want to hear more. And Juanita Peters. Hi, Juanita.
Hey.
Award-winning storyteller, writer, and director of multiple award-winning documentaries, including Hannah's Story, I Made a Vow, and Africa Can't Stop Now. And you were one of the directors of a show that is very near and dear to my heart called Studio Black, which was produced with Picture Plant Productions and aired on CBC.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Right on.
Hi, everyone. So just to jump right in, my first question, which I sort of desperately want to ask every Black woman that I encounter in the business, is how did you get into the business? How did that start? Juanita, can we start with you?
Purely by accident. That's the honest to God's truth. Purely by accident. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a Canadian film industry, or I actually started as a writer, writing small shows, skits if you want to call them, and I landed an audition at a radio station, which I auditioned for. It was a Burger King commercial. I auditioned as an old woman, as an old man, and as a dog, and a little girl. And it was a national Burger King commercial, and I did get the commercial as the little girl, and it introduced me to writers. It introduced me to continuity writers at this particular radio station, and then they started calling me. I started going in and auditioning for various other things and voicing commercials. I wound up taking a radio and television broadcasting course. At that time, it was at vocational school in Kentville. So it didn't cost me anything. You know, if I figured if this doesn't work out, I can choose something else in the trades. And it just so happened that I feel like I've always been very blessed and been in a lot of the right places at the right time and surrounded by a lot of different creators. I wound up going to work at the radio station. I was the afternoon newscaster by the time I was 19. By the time I was 21, I was doing the morning show. But it was a different time, when you could really get your feet wet and try out a lot of things. Yeah, and just one thing led to another door opens. I have to say, I was in radio and television as a newscaster for the first half of my life, and the transition to film was not easy. It was not as receiving as you would think it would be. For me, I was a storyteller, and I tell stories in many different ways, but the film industry didn't quite look at it that way. They looked at it as two different mediums, and it took, I'm going to tell you, almost a decade to actually make that transition, which was quite interesting. But in the meantime, you just keep working.
Yeah, okay. I want to talk about transitions at some point tonight for sure. Thank you. Josiane, what about you? How did you get in the biz?
Yeah, totally. I think it's a bit of the same, not the same story, but it just happened for me as well. So basically, initially, I wanted to study science, and then back in Cégep in Quebec, and then I was missing a credit, so I ended up going into communication. While I was expecting to do my maths to go into science to become an architect. And that actually never happened. I kind of fell in love with all the mediums, the camera, the radio, and then I studied journalism. I thought I wanted to be a journalist, so I did 2 years of journalism class, and then I realized that I didn't want to be a journalist because I cared more about the story of the people behind the actual news than I cared for the news itself. So I worked in international development for a while, and then I was traveling a lot. I went to different countries, and then I would have a camera with me, and I would start documenting. So that's kind of how I got into documentary filmmaking, because everywhere I went, I just ended up documenting and creating short films about people's story I would met along the way. And fast forward, I ended up moving to Toronto for a job opportunity as a researcher for a TV station. And then 6 months later, I was pitching a project, and my producer was like, "Do you want to direct it?" I was like, "Yeah." And then that's kind of how it all started. So I directed that short documentary web series about amazing teenagers doing amazing things. So I traveled around Canada, and I met different teenagers doing crazy projects, volunteering and all sort of things, and starting their own companies. And after that, I just wanted to push my projects further, so I decided to go independent, and I've been independent for 2 years, 2 years now.
Fantastic! Congratulations. And Cheryl, what about you? How did you get in the biz?
I would say my entry into filmmaking was because I had a mentor. I am a descendant of the Black migration of 1910 to the Prairie provinces. So between 1905 and 1912, there were about 1,500 or 2,000 Black people from the southern U.S. who came up to northern Alberta and northern Saskatchewan. And as a writer, that was the story I wanted to tell. It's a story that's not well known in the rest of Canada, but it's an incredible story. And so I wrote a book 30 years ago that was about my life and my discovery of that history and its impact on me. And around about the same time, I met Selwyn Jacob, who you probably have heard of. He was a brilliant NFB producer who just retired from the Vancouver office of the NFB just recently. Selwyn was in Alberta at that time and had made a short film called We Remember Amber Valley. Amber Valley was the most northerly of the 5 small communities that these Black farmers created. And it is considered probably to be the most northerly community of Black people that has ever existed anywhere in the world, quite far north here in Alberta. Selwyn and I met at a function of some kind. And because he was a filmmaker and he knew that I was interested in the same story that he wanted to tell, he's from the Caribbean, he's from Trinidad, but he, as a Black person living in Alberta, was fascinated by this undertold story. He asked me to work with him on a very short NFB drama called Carol's Mirror, which I think you mentioned in the intro, Kumbi. And then a little bit later, he really cajoled me to write and direct a film for the National Film Board in the early 2000s called The Journey of Leslie Martin. It was out of those two experiences with Selwyn that I got hired on as a story editor for a TV show and did some consulting on a number of films, and ultimately, which led me to pitch my film about the beautiful, beautiful man, a famous Black cowboy, famous out here, and I hope soon to be more famous across the rest of the country. Just an incredible figure. He arrived in southern Alberta in 1882. He was essentially the greatest cowboy that has ever lived, became a successful rancher, and now there are 7 geographic locations named for him in Alberta. He had a Canada Post stamp. I just feel like it was time for a person of African descent to tell John Ware's story through the medium of film. I, like Josiane and Juanita, am a storyteller. I write all kinds of different things. I've done journalism, I've done books, I've done kids' books, I've done radio, I've done theater, and it is the story that I want to tell that motivates me as a filmmaker. If there's a piece of this story that I feel is best told on film, then that's how I'm going to try to do it. So that's essentially my story.
I love that. And I think it's so interesting that you mentioned having a mentor, because something that's been a huge part of my story was a lack of mentor, really. I started as an actor, and being on sets, it wasn't until I moved to Toronto and had written my first short film and was explaining to the director that I wanted to have on the short film all of the shots and images that I saw, and they stopped me and they were like, "Why aren't you directing that?" And Josiane, I think you said something similar of it was someone being like, "Would you direct, like, shouldn't you direct this?" But it's like, oh, yeah. And I'm always so fascinated at how people came to the conclusion that that was something they could do, because it took me so long to realize that that was an option, that was a possibility, because I similarly felt like such a storyteller, but I felt like there were only specific ways that I could do that. And it took a while. And then actually, Juanita was the first ever Black film director that I ever met, and was like, "Oh, it's possible. I can do it." So I understand that for the need for mentorship, I think, is so important. So I guess a question that sort of comes from that first question is, to anyone who's thinking about being a film director or who wants to, we've heard a couple stories of stumbling into it, a couple stories of mentors sort of nudging us into it, but what is something that you would say to someone maybe even in high school that is thinking about directing? Anyone?
I have to say that, one of the things that's really great is, I'm close to 60, so film, when I started, was something that was very far-reaching, and film was very expensive, very expensive. And so since we've moved into the video era, it gives more opportunity to people to go out and try things. And I am always so shocked and pleased when I see high school kids making films on their cameras, on their phones, it's so accessible now. So it's like you can try things, have fun with it, so that when the door opens, you don't feel nervous. You know that you can handle it.
I love that. Yeah.
Wow. I totally agree with that, Juanita. I'm also flabbergasted by what young people are able to do, and just their tech savvy around all the different ways that you can tell a story on film now. I would also say to young people who want to be filmmakers, um, if there is someone out there who you would like to have as a mentor, I would encourage you to reach out and to try to find a way to get an introduction to that person. One of the things that I have found to be true in my career is that um, Black women and men who work in film and in other media are very generous, and we want our stories to be told. We know that the burden of telling the stories can't rest on a few people. We also know that young people have a completely different story than what we have. And so I would encourage people to reach out if there's someone whose work you admire or someone who's in your region of the country who's doing the kind of work that you want to do. Do try to get in touch.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that one of the things that personally really impacted my life as an emerging filmmaker is meeting the right people. I think that's one of the big and important part. And I think there's obviously reaching out for a mentor is a great thing, but also putting yourself out there in terms of seeking opportunities. I think a lot of like some smaller film festival or bigger film festivals, sometimes they're not always accessible because they're pricey, but smaller film festival will have they'll have workshops, and they'll have networking events and opportunities for you to actually meet other filmmakers and other people who have more experience in the industry. And because it's such a game, I feel, of contacts and knowing the right people and seeking these opportunities, I think it's a great way as well to be able to start creating those connections, because I think it's super important. Whether it's even people from your same level, I think it's still very valuable to meet people that are going to become your partners in crime, so quote unquote, people you're going to work with, or we're going to be willing to come and work on your crazy film where you have zero budget, but you have passion and you believe in your story. I think you definitely need to meet those people, because it's a group, like making a film. It's group work, right? You can't do it. I mean, you can, but it's very difficult, and it's way more fun when you're doing it with other people than all by yourself trying to figure out everything. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that idea. I would like shake my fist and be like, I'm not a painter. I can't just go into a room by myself and paint. Like I need other people. I need collaborators. It's so true. You mentioned something about the budgets there, and I'm wondering, I've noticed that women, when we started seeing all the statistics about women's in the director's chair and the amount of women who were actually directing, it felt like in documentary, the numbers weren't as horrible as they were in the fiction narrative scripted world. Did anybody does that sound right? Am I like off the mark there? Is that true? Or
No, you're absolutely true. There have been far more women directors in Canada in the documentary field than in drama, than in television series, than in fiction. And we're trying to change that. We're also trying to change the roles that you see women in the industry. More camera women. We need more camera women. We need more editors, in the field. Story editors, because how a female story editor might see that piece that I'm trying to craft might be very different from how a male story editor would see that in the significant parts of it, right? So, we want to see more women in the technical side. We want to see them everywhere, in the industry, everywhere that they want to be, everywhere we want to be. Yeah.
Agreed. I have nothing to add. Well said. Definitely.
yeah, that's the big, like, yeah. I think so often the panels yeah, we end up sort of saying the same thing where it's like, we need more of us in general.
I want to go back to something you were talking mentioned earlier in terms of collaboration. And we know, Cheryl, when you're sitting with a project for a very long time, as we often do, before it gets that nod from somebody who's actually going to help us, get it off the ground, there's this thing that, because you've been so tied to it alone, that collaboration doesn't feel as easy in the beginning as we'd like it to be, because it's been your baby, you've been driving it, and then of course, once you're able to, bring it to the collection of people who can make it that much better, you see the pudding, in the process later. But I just want to, speak to that because as women, I think we are even more tight around the product because there are so few of us, and we are, often very nervous that, if we step out too soon and we're not ready, are we going to look silly? Are people going to, are they going to drop us? Or, but I think, it's one of the great things of having forums like this where we can see who the women are in the field. And I've picked up the phone many times and called some of my sisters from Women in the Director's Chair and said, have you ever had this happen before? And what do you think of it? And I trust them to say, Juanita, that's just crazy, or, maybe you might want to think of this a little differently. What if you were to add this? Or, it's a more comfortable environment than stepping out. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I think also we do feel protective of our stories if we've been nurturing them along for a long time. Also, because of the way our stories have been told in the past, that just doesn't feel right. So I think we do kind of want to keep a close watch over, some areas perhaps where there are other people who know more or know better. And so it is about learning to walk that line to make sure that your material is being honored and respected, and also know when you have a trusting relationship with someone who's got a way better eye in the editing suite or, behind the camera even. I think it is a tricky balancing act, learning to walk that balance. And I also wanted to go back again to something Josiane said about budgets and how sometimes young people just don't have access to the funding. And one of the things that I would really like to see is to have a larger pool of resources available, because it can be very hard to realize your actual true vision with a low budget. And, again, I'm very impressed with what people are able to do sometimes, but I often wish that young Black filmmakers did have more access to the resources.
And what do you think that requires? What do you think we need for that to happen?
I think we need to advocate to the funding bodies and to the to places like the National Film Board to make sure that resources specifically for Black artists are there. That it's not just a generalized sort of people of color pot of funding. What we know, and what others are learning more and more is that each community, each racialized community, or each equity-seeking community face different challenges. And one of the challenges that we face is something that a couple of you have mentioned, that in the beginning you don't really think, well, is this something I can do? When somebody says to you, how would you like to direct it? It's just like, I guess I'd never thought of that. I had never thought of that as an option for me. So I think we need to get places like the National Film Board and some of the other funding bodies to go out into the communities and to make it known that those Canadian institutions are there for young Black filmmakers, just as they are for everybody else.
I would absolutely agree, Cheryl. Is everyone familiar with the Talent to Watch program? The telefilm, it used to be the micro budget, and now it's the Talent to Watch.
Yeah, I'm actually a recipient of that program this year.
Congrats! Yeah, I was a recipient last year, which I think was the first year that they had changed it to the Talent to Watch program as opposed to the micro budget program. And they kind of did this like huge overhaul of that program, and they really were trying to focus on this idea of diversity or inclusion and accessibility and all of these things. And I thought it was really interesting because some of the things they did really worked. Some of the things they did, like partnering with programs or organizations like Real World or even Emerging Lens here in Halifax, and essentially opening some of those doors of the people who used to be the gatekeepers, where you could only apply through certain very white organizations. They reached out to other organizations who had a different reach and allowed people to apply to the program through them. And I thought, that's so great. It's like, it really makes such a difference. However, I'm curious to know if the numbers really changed that significantly in terms of the applications, because even though certainly more people were seeing the applications or learning about the program, when you open up the documents, they're still just as dense, I'll say, or overwhelming, or the things that are required of you to get into the program still feel like you need the sort of like traditional background or education just to be able to fill out the program application. So like thinking of what you were saying, Cheryl, about the outreach, and like I completely agree. And I feel like it's also the next step of also making it more accessible in the actual language, so that someone doesn't need to know how to fill out a full telefilm budget, which is like pages and pages. It's so overwhelming, but still feel like they can access it.
I think it's interesting because as someone who is going through that process right now, and totally understand what you mean about the chaotic of like trying to understand and dealing, because we are, there is definitely still work in improvement. I think it's a great program and it's a great first step. However, I think as well, as you mentioned, I had this discussion with other friends where I feel like, you know, it says it's for emerging, but there's still a level of, you know, knowledge, of experience that you need to have in order to be able to actually make it to the other side. I feel like, you know, just a few years ago from here, I wouldn't have been able to get through this just because I didn't have that kind of level of knowledge, right? So there needs to be more into it to actually support people. And I'm not familiar with what Real World did or other programs did. Maybe they support people through the process to help them be able to get there. Hopefully they do. On my personal side, it was more of my team putting everything on their own. And just because I gained that experience before, I was able to kind of put everything together in a way to actually be successful. But I definitely think there's a place for improvement. I know also people have mentioned in terms of, I think in the Talent to Watch, the jury is mixed. Some people have questioned the idea of like how diverse is the jury, that people making the decisions in those terms, in the big instance who finance the project. So that's a very good question as well, because I know people face challenges when they come with stories that are from their community, but then everybody at the deciding table doesn't necessarily understand that perspective. So that this can be another challenge. But I've heard recently, I think it's Telefilm, that's going to be supporting the Black Screen Office initiative. Yes, and I think that's another step in the right direction, right, to support more Black creators.
Yeah, I always say like, oh, I'm new here, but in reality, I feel like actually I need to stop saying that, because it has been almost 5 years now, and even in just those 5 years, I'm seeing like it really does feel like telefilm, and I'm not as familiar with National Film Board, but it does feel like people are moving in the right direction. We're having the right kinds of conversations. It is moving, and now the kind of exciting part is figuring out those nuances, figuring out what actually specifically, okay, we're shining a light on it, but what does that mean? What do we specifically need? Which is exciting.
Josiane and Kumbi, because you've both been through that experience, what would you recommend that they do differently that helps people to acquire those sort of entryway skills? Like what could they do differently to provide, if there was like a pre-application workshop, or if they were to match people up with mentors, what do you think they could do differently to be that bridging step?
I guess that's a very good question. I think pre-application mentors would be great. I feel as someone who's fairly new-ish into the industry, I have so many questions. And now I do have those resources. I do have those people around me that I can turn around and be like, I don't understand tax credit. Can you please explain that to me because I'm confused? And then somebody, I know who to reach out to. But when you're just starting, all these questions, even though there's information on the internet, it's so difficult to, like, it's so complicated as someone who's just starting, right? Just like, so I think that definitely they could pair up people with mentors who can actually help them through those applications, as Kumbi mentioned, like with telefilm, and putting together a budget and make sure that they know exactly what they need to include and not to forget some of the important stuff. And like, just like something, I think there's a lot of stuff, especially when it comes to producing, that you don't know unless you've been through it. Like, you don't know exactly how much something costs unless you know. So I think and I'm saying this with passion because I recently realized that as I read budgets over and over again, realizing that I keep forgetting stuff on them. And, you know, and I'm laughing right now, but I wasn't a few weeks ago. But I think definitely, you know, we need that access to someone who can say, listen, this is how much that costs. You should think about these items. Otherwise, you can't possibly know, right? And it's definitely a barrier if you haven't, you know, had access to these knowledge. And sometimes there's different barriers, right? You can't necessarily do internship unpaid for so many months and stuff like that. You know, you don't have access if you need to work. Not everybody has the capability of being like a 6-month intern for free, right? So yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, I completely